Hello, everyone, and welcome once again to the Temple Institute Parsha class. My name is Gedalia Meyer. I'm podcasting from Ma'ale Adumim in Israel. When we think of miracles, we tend to think of the Bible. When we think of miracles in the Bible, we tend to think of the open and earth-shattering type, like the splitting of the sea or the giving of the Ten Commandments at Mount Sinai. The plagues may or may not fit into this type of miracle, as might be the case with something like the manna falling from heaven. People expect showstoppers when they look for miracles. Anything of the more mundane variety tends to get brushed off as a souped-up coincidence. We have come to question the reality of miracles as we move steadily towards a more scientific approach to life. Anything as supernatural as a miracle is generally dismissed as nothing more than an exaggeration or out-and-out nonsense. Perhaps there is something healthy to this modern skepticism. Believing in just any old miracle story tends to cheapen the value of whatever true miracles that may have happened in the past. Not everything is a miracle, and even what seems like a miracle might be nothing more than things just working out for a change. But that does not mean that real miracles don't actually take place, even now. They just may not be of the splitting of the sea variety that we take as our miracle standard. There could be subtler miracles on a more pedestrian level that seem like everyday natural events, but in reality are the hidden hand of God somehow intervening in our lives. It is these hidden miracles that we must look to if we wish to find evidence of some divine hand in the world. Don't expect to convince your skeptical friends about these miracles, however. These miracles are personal and are meant to stay that way. This week's Parsha is called Bo. That small and unassuming word means come, an equally small and unassuming word. It refers to God's instruction to Moshe to come and speak to Pharaoh once again, to warn him about the coming of the 8th plague. This was the plague of locusts, which would devastate whatever was left of Egypt after the first 7 plagues. There were still 2 more after this, darkness and the killing of the firstborn. It was only with that final plague that Pharaoh once and for all relented and released the Israelites. But even after that, as it will turn out in next week's Parsha, he had misgivings and chased after them. But as with these final 3 plagues that things definitely reached a crescendo. Whatever had happened up to then was really only a warm-up for what was coming. Locusts were the classic apocalyptic disaster of the Middle East. They eat everything, even if it had already been partially wiped out by hail. Darkness is truly terrifying. People were stuck wherever they were when the plague hit, since they couldn't see where they were going. The sense of helplessness was probably overwhelming and only served to underscore what must have been a feeling of powerlessness in the face of this divinely ordained onslaught. The killing of the firstborn, the classic biblical plague, was the fitting encore to what could only be seen as a series of disasters that demonstrated the invincible hand of God. But it turns out that there were miracles of the more hidden variety going on in the midst of all this fire and brimstone. These things are easily overlooked in all the drama of the plagues. But they were there, and in a sense, were even more dramatic than the bells and whistles of the hail, locusts, or darkness. What were these hidden miracles? They are almost hidden in the text itself, so we have to dig a little deeper to find them. Way back at the burning bush, Moshe was told in the course of all the instructions about let my people go and all that, to instruct the Israelites to ask the Egyptians for, quote, vessels of gold and silver and clothing to place upon your sons and daughters, and Egypt would be emptied. This command was repeated in this week's Parsha during the instructions for the final plague. Basically, it was the same thing, asking their Egyptian neighbors for gold and silver vessels. However, this time, there is an additional detail. The text states that God would, quote, give grace to the people in the eyes of the Egyptians. Why this additional factor is necessary is left unclear. In the narrative of the actual final plague, all this played out. The text states explicitly that the Israelites, quote, asked from the Egyptians vessels of gold and silver and clothing. God gave grace to the people in the eyes of the Egyptians, and they gave them the items, and Egypt was emptied. Again, we do not know why it was necessary for this mysterious grace to be given, but it seems to have played some essential function in making all this work out. In addition to the puzzling grace, there is another question on this whole seemingly minor detail of the Exodus. Why was all this necessary to begin with? After all, this was the Exodus, arguably the biggest miracle of the Bible and one of the defining events in the history of the world. What did it matter if they asked for these gold and silver vessels or not? They were leaving after 200 years of servitude. They probably would have been perfectly happy to get out with just the shirts on their backs. But this was no minor detail. It was told twice to Moshe in the vital prophetic instructions he received. God didn't waste words on minor stuff that could have been left out. The Torah makes sure to tell us that this indeed happened, even though it seems a bit underwhelming coming in the middle of the killing of the firstborn and the whole Exodus story. But there it is, right there in the text. Why was this needed? First, let us deal with that little matter of grace. Grace is a word that Jews prefer not to use. For better or worse, it has been monopolized as a Christian word, and Jews tend to avoid it. It suggests a little too much of a personal divine touch for Jewish tastes, and they prefer using Hebrew words to say essentially the same thing as grace. But the fact is that this word is not all that rare in the Bible, and it seems to be one of the ways in which God intervenes in human affairs. It may not be all that dramatic, but it does hit the spot when needed. Thus, out of lack of any better word, grace is it. Why was this grace required to begin with? Why couldn't the Israelites just ask for those items and the Egyptians be all too willing to give them? This one is easy to answer. Things just don't work out that way. Nobody simply hands over their gold or silver just because their longtime neighbor who is about to leave asks for them. Why should they part with their valuable items for no reason whatsoever other than that the Israelites were requesting them? This is where the grace enters the picture. The whole thing would never have come to fruition had the grace not been applied. Grace was the subtle miracle in all this. It was the magical willingness of the Egyptians to be all too eager to grant the Israelites their request. This was a miracle of the first order. The only difference between this and the run-of-the-mill biblical miracle is that in this case, nobody knew that it happened. But why was it necessary for this whole scheme to happen in the first place? To answer this, we have to enter into the realm of speculation. The Torah simply states that it was to happen and that it did. It provides no reason why. But perhaps the answer isn't all that mysterious. Perhaps this was indeed a necessary facet of the Exodus. In addition to the physical Exodus, with the plagues and all the hoopla, there had to be a kind of emotional exodus, a form of closure to this episode of biblical history. It would not do to have the Israelites merely leave with just the shirts on their backs. They had to receive something for their suffering, and their Egyptian oppressors had to provide it. This idea speaks to the human need for both closure and the internal demand for some form of justice to resolve our sufferings. Whether this need is justified or not, and whether or not it really ever gets fulfilled, are questions that we all have to answer individually. But in this particular case, the Torah seems to be saying that this need is real, and if there is some sense of divine justice, it should be answered. We all feel this need. We all in some way want to see it happen, at least when we are the victims who hope for some restitution. It is a very human need that cuts to the core of human goals and even to the very meaning of life. Without this need being fulfilled, we cannot avoid a sense of emptiness, as if there is a hole in the grand picture of reality. This hole must be filled if we are to become complete. This is where the miracle of grace enters the scene. Grace is not doled out like candy. It only comes at those opportune moments when we either deserve it or there is some divine reason to make things happen a certain way. In this case, it is likely that both factors were at play. The Israelites did deserve this grace. They had suffered, and all suffering demands to be addressed in some way. The Egyptians were the oppressors, and they had to pay the price for their part in the Israelite suffering. While these gold and silver vessels may not have fully addressed this demand, it was certainly a step in the right direction. In addition, the Exodus was one of those all too rare moments in history in which things actually work out as intended. The sense of justice was there, even if it needed a bit of hidden boost from the divinely inspired grace. This was the way to get things straightened out. The Exodus serves as a kind of prototype for the way things should be if God would engineer things according to plan. Even something as seemingly extraneous as this sense of justice had to be there. The Exodus would not have been the Exodus without this. Perhaps the most interesting thing about all of this is that there is the possibility of divine intervention even on something as personal as one person's feelings towards another. This grace was really that. It was the way the Egyptians felt about the Israelites' request of those items. That feeling, whether the Egyptians sensed it or not, was achieved by divine manipulation of the mind. Who knows how often this is going on right within our very own minds at any point in our lives. Grace may feel like the most natural thing in the world, but in truth, it may be a subtle miracle taking place right under our noses. Shabbat Shalom.